So, welcome everybody, and thank you again, Professor Steinbock, for being here today.
Thank you.
Today we are recording a session of questions and answers that are being asked during these days. So I will first ask Professor Steinbock a few questions that the community of phenomenologists asked before the video. And these questions will address mostly chapter 1, 2, and 5 on phenomenology and mysticism. Meanwhile, we are connected with the National Autonomous University of Mexico, so Dr. Esteban Marin will take the floor and will ask his students and the people that are together for their seminar other questions, again, based on the video and on Steinbock's thoughts that are coming up now. So my first question for you, Professor Steinbock, comes from Julian Apostolescu. And he asked you what possibility or impossibility does the concept of a vertical giveness name, and what motivated you to develop this concept? So
yes. Okay, yeah, I'll begin with that one. The other questions that he asked, I just want to say, are very good as well, and they have a more explicit response in phenomenology and mysticism. So I'll just pass on to this one. Mm-hmm. Also, regarding the concept of vertical givenness and what it names, that was also addressed, but what motivated the concept, maybe not so clearly. So actually, I'll respond to this one. It was more of an experiential observation originally, and it took place when I began climbing with a friend of mine, his name is Jean-Luc. And he took me climbing, and I said, well, like, why would anybody want to do that? And although I was intrigued by it, and so we went to a rock cliff, maybe, 30, 40 meters, and I stood before this rock cliff, and I was cold, I was nervous, the rock face felt cold, and I started this climb, and he had secured me, with the rope and so on. But nevertheless, I tried to grab myself at this rock cliff. I'm using all my arms, basically overpowering it, trying to overpower it, and I lost. Oh. I lost in the sense that it took me, I don't know how, an hour or more to get up this thing, and I was exhausted by the time I got over the top, and my arms were so tired I couldn't even lift the water bottle. I was just trying to bring it all up. But we stayed out there for days, and then eventually coming back, weeks, and little by little, what was at first unnatural to me became very natural. And I don't really know how it happened, but all of my movements became redefined in terms of vertical ascension. And every little nook and cranny, every little hole became a possibility of basically vertical movement. And I realized I can't try to overpower this thing. I'm going to lose. And it's not even about your arms anyway. It's all sorts of other things, and I was grabbing really tightly to this, I just trying to almost be on the cliff. And, but little by little, all these little movements, it all became warmer. And all these possibilities of ascension just kind of revealed themselves as I became more attentive to them. And they just became pathways to ascend. All these little marks, all these little holes, and more became illuminated, really, as I began to do that, more evident. And then I began to climb this rock face, which was more like a rock face now than a rock cliff, with a fraction of the time, 15 minutes or something like that. And it would seem to me, although they were and then do technically more difficult climbs in a fraction of the time, and would seem no effort, almost felt like no effort. I got up, didn't feel it. And so I no longer had a stranglehold on it, and this space opened up between the rock face and myself, actually, so I was able to be both held with it and apart from it. And it just became this whole reorientation of movement. Mm-hmm. And I noticed, so this was all happening, and I didn't really notice it all happening until actually one time we went back into the city. This is back into Brussels. And I started every little crevice on a building, every little ledge, everything became now a possibility of going upwards. And so it was they had this city of walking on sidewalks, going up in elevators, going on roads, but now I was oriented vertically, so that, that's why the window sill, the door frame, everything became possibilities now of moving vertically. And now I started always to, be oriented in that way and looked up, but it wasn't really me looking up. It was almost as if I was directed from above toward a possibility of movement. And I just started rethinking all of the way that I have viewed things. And when I was reading the mystics too, their descriptions of those kinds of efforts or non-efforts, but also the ungraspableness, the not ability to control, the dimension of mystery, all these things started opening up, and I found this real resonance with verticality in the sense that I had experienced it, aesthetically, I would say, and their writings, but not just them either. I mean, so the more I started reading it, the more I started using this term, the more I started seeing it everywhere. In Bachelard, for example, he speaks of the vertical, Merleau-Ponty, the vertical. And some of these texts I have in Phenomenology and Mysticism. The poet Auden, he said, let us honor, if we can, the vertical man, though we value none but the horizontal one. And so all these came up. So it just became, I wanted to use that quote, but they wouldn't let me. So anyway. But so I footnoted in there. But the point is, I saw these resonances everywhere with the vertical, and it seemed to make sense. It was more than a metaphor. It was an experiential, an existential dimension that it seemed to me to express the spiritual, also psychological, upright posture, all these in psychology and psychopathology, aesthetically, all of this came together. And so that's the reason why I use a sense of vertical givenness.
Well, thank you for sharing with us this experience and having led us into this beautiful realm where literature, philosophy, religion talk with each other. Now I'll move to Professor Drummond's question, in which he asked, so here we are moving slightly toward your book on moral emotions. So he asks, what's the distinctive intentional structure of moral emotions?
Yes, and I wanted to look, just briefly address that question.
Absolutely.
Is the light okay?
It is, for me, yeah.
You know what, I'm going to do what I did last time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry. We have a motion detector in here, and it's just...
I say when there's too much still.
Yeah. So, okay, because what his question implies, although I won't say a whole lot about the distinctive structure of the moral emotions, but it does highlight the issue of evidence with which we began last week, and what outlines the basic project that concerns the phenomenology and mysticism and religious experience. And so just as a quick reminder, I distinguish a mode of givenness with which we're most familiar, called presentation, mainly a noesis noema structure. I won't go into that anymore. From vertical modes of givenness, and there are several vertical modes of givenness that I've named: epiphany, which is religious dimension; revelation, which concerns the human interpersonal, let's say, manifestation, which concerns what we can call icon or products, objects, that also have a vertical resonance, the possibility of it; exposure, which concerns incarnate existence; display elements, and then the earth as earth's ground, which is disclosure. So those are the ones that I've named, and they all have distinctive structures, all distinctive from this one kind of intentionality, although these are kinds of intentionalities too, although they have different structures. And I think this is what's behind Professor Drummond's question. And so the easiest way to reply is that it's not this distinctive structure that's peculiar to the religious dimension and the let's say moral or ethical interpersonal human interpersonal dimension is not a noesis noema structure. It's not a subject relation to an object, and nor, but this is the main thing, and even Husserl admits this, as I mentioned, but these experiences are not founded in them either, which is to say they do not borrow their relation of sense, to have a relation of sense with that, from what's happening in perception or what's happening in judgment or what's happening in an eidetic, a simple relation with an idea, for example. So they're cognitive, but they're not necessarily epistemic, an epistemic relation as Husserl described those. So what would that mean for the religious dimension? And what I found in my investigations from phenomenology and mysticism, and the particular mystics with whom I dealt, is that there is the experience is given. That means in this sense of the holy, without, as opposed to what we'd find in like a perceptual experience, it's given without measure. It's given all of a sudden, experienced absolutely. It's given fully, but inexhaustively, where there's a clarity as a coming from elsewhere, which it is kind of an experience that's not a matter of negotiation. It's not a matter of what gives itself is not a product of what I provoke, as we can find in perception. So already we see differences there. The how it relates then to the question of the moral emotions then is, it would be easy to say, well, okay, what I mean by moral emotions are interpersonal emotions. Not necessarily good or bad, but so the interpersonal of a human interpersonal or finite persons. It'd be easy to say, well, okay, there's this one other kind of vertical givenness that's simply different from presentation. Now, I don't want to presuppose, and we shouldn't presuppose that that's the case. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I found it wasn't the case, and that the moral emotions, also have a distinctive structure that falls within it does have an overarching similarity or overarching essential structure of vertical givenness, because it's not simply dependent upon a subject in relation to an object, and for various other reasons. So they are all similar in the sense they're vertical modes of givenness, but within themselves, within the vertical, they also have a distinctive structure. So even the moral emotions of, let's say, shame or guilt or repentance will have a different structure from epiphany, what I call epiphany in the religious dimension of experience, although they're still vertical modes of givenness. And so how do you determine, this is all I'll say about it, how do we determine that? Well, one way we can look at it, or what are the structures, the temporal dimensions of those experiences? Do they follow along the lines of a presentational one? No. But are they themselves distinct? And what about the relation to otherness? And then, in particular, there are modalities. As I mentioned last week, they have a different relation to an absolute oughtness, as Husserl will call it, and that they're the terms of necessity, contingency, possibility, motivation, all of those things, while they are appropriate for a perceptual experience, they're not appropriate because they don't get at these other kinds of, let's say, religious, or in this case, the moral emotions. And so that they're distinctive. They are distinctive because they are neither, just to summarize it, they're neither a noesis noema relation in the way that a perceptual one, and that can be a very dynamic structure, an active-active structure already, constitutive duet, as I've mentioned in Husserl, as Husserl says. We don't find that in these other kinds of experiences. And they have a different kind of temporality, a distinctive one. That is to say, they are internal to the very experience itself. When we describe that, they have a distinctive relation to, or a unique relation to, otherness in different cases, and then also their modalities and their modalizations. Their problems of self-deception, or deception, the problems of confirmation, of so-called testing the experiences, the historical efficacy of the experiences. Those are unique to those series of experiences. Mm-hmm. That's how we would say that they are distinctive. But even within the moral emotions, some of them are going to have, on different layers, different dimensions. And so the structure of shame or guilt or embarrassment will have, which are interpersonal emotions, they have what I call a diremptive. They're a diremptive experience because of this kind of bifurcation that occurs and being thrown back on oneself in the presence of another. Now, that's going to have a different structure from, let's say, hope, even though hope is also a distinctive experience. So just to give one example of how how hope, a simple example of hope, would be a distinct from presentation, and then I'll leave it to the next question. Okay. If I hope that to use the example from last week, if I hope that it snows, even though I expect it to rain, if I hope, then I take a very mundane example because I want to make this point. I'm on the one hand directed toward an object in the same way I would be in a perceptual presentation, a perceptual givenness. I hope that something, 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 okay? And it's I who hopes. But what's happening is at the moment I hope, or in and through, or what gives rise to the hope, is simultaneously the givenness of a ground of hope that subtends the I hope that. And that ground of hope is not something I intend. Now, we don't have to specify what that ground is. It could be luck, it could be fortune, it could be God, it could be, but I don't say, oh, I'm going to intend a ground of hope, God, so that something will happen. That might be magic, that might be what, but that's not the experience of hope. The peculiar thing is that hope, in the moment, in the instant that it arises, it doubly opens. A ground of hope is given, in and through which what I hope is now a sustainable possibility. It's not guaranteed. If it were guaranteed, I'd be confident that I wouldn't need to hope. If it were denied, I wouldn't need to hope. But it's given as what I called in the moral emotions as a sustainable possibility. It's sustained, even if objectively speaking, I don't know, everybody thinks I'm nuts, if they think I'm in denial. If I hope, there's that double structure of a ground of hope that's given that sustains that hope as sustainable for me who hopes. That is already a religious, I would say, in its core, that already has a religious content to it, okay? Because there's a dimension of the dependence, a givenness, and it's not a positing of, but a givenness of some kind of ground that allows me, in my experience, to hope that. So that would be one example of how that doesn't correspond to, it's not founded in an expectation, because an expectation doesn't have that dual structure. I expect it to rain, period. Why? Because of the present and past. And I can say that, but you don't have that same structure with the ground of hope, because it may have never been present or past. If I never have had an experience of my friend breaking out of jail or something, but I hope he gets out of jail or something, or I hope I survive a tsunami if I never had an experience of that. it's not dependent in the same way. So it has a radically unique structure. And so what we in phenomenology want to do is to examine those particular nuances that concern modalities, temporality, relation to otherness, and so on. And that particular example could be peculiar to religious experience that would have an independent structure. So that's just the example of that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, I have plenty of questions related to just this answer, of course. It's such an interesting topic. But let's move to the other question, which was a question of mine, in fact, as well. How can we avoid that mysticism might be flattened to a form of psychologism?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So there are 2 or 3 ways of getting at this problem. The one would be excuse me. One would be saying, well, is there any way that we can avoid mysticism being disregarded by psychologism? That's one possibility. And then another one might be, how can we avoid that mystical experiences are not mere pathologies or mere objects, mere psychological pathologies or psychological aberrations, or are they? Now that might be a little bit more reading into your question, but it might be related. And so I don't know if that's legitimate interpretation of that. But for the first one, I think it would be the first aspect of this: can we avoid that mysticism, let's say, is not really disregarded through psychologism? Is there any way of looking at that? And that, if that's what, one of the questions, we could say it depends on giving, or at least being open to the possibility that there are experiences that do not conform to a presentational style of givenness. And I'll put it another way now. It would be not presupposing that the dualism between reason and sensibility that was established in the Enlightenment period, that dualism is appropriate. It would be seen that that's not an appropriate articulation of the human person. Why I say that is, after that period, it's not that the emotions, for example, or these kinds of experiences were absent. It's just that they didn't have a rational justification that Enlightenment rationality wanted for. Now, there's a lot of good things about Enlightenment rationality, but what it did was to reduce anything that couldn't fit in that dualism, either so everything in spirit was reduced to something in psychology, or sensibility. Now, from that period, and what I mean, have I lost you there?
Yeah, but we can still hear you.
I'll wait until I get you back.
All right.